The gunshot cracked through the pines like a bone snapping, and Coulter Hayes knew immediately that someone was either dead or about to be. He'd been tracking stray cattle through the Colorado high country for 3 days, alone except for the magpies and his increasingly bad thoughts, when that single rifle shot tore the August silence apart. What he found in the clearing changed everything. A young woman in a torn dress standing over a man's body, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the rifle, her mouth opening and closing without sound, and her eyes, those dark, terrified eyes, locking onto his like he was either her last hope or her next executioner. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Coulter Hayes wasn't the kind of man who went looking for trouble, but he'd learned a long time ago that trouble didn't particularly care about his preferences. At 32, he'd spent the better part of a decade drifting between cattle operations across the Colorado Territory, working seasonal roundups and fence repairs, sleeping under stars more often than roofs. He preferred it that way. Animals made sense. People generally didn't. The summer of 1876 had been brutal. The kind of heat that made the pine resin bubble and turned creek beds into networks of cracked mud. Coulter had been hired by the Double J Ranch to track down about 15 head of cattle that had wandered off during a storm 2 weeks back. The pay was decent enough, and the work got him away from the bunkhouse and the endless poker games and the kind of conversations that made him remember why he preferred solitude. He'd been following hoofprints through increasingly rough terrain when he heard it. The shot. It wasn't the distant pop of a hunter taking down an elk. This was close. Maybe a quarter-mile north, tucked somewhere in the thick stand of lodgepole pine that choked the mountainside. Coulter reined in his horse, a gray gelding named Ash, who had better sense than most people, and listened. Nothing. Just wind moving through the high branches and a raven calling from somewhere unseen. His first instinct was to turn around. Gunshots in the wilderness rarely led to anything good, and getting involved in someone else's mess was a reliable way to end up with a mess of your own. But something about the silence afterward felt wrong. One shot, then nothing. No follow-up, no shouting, just that heavy quiet that settles over a forest when something unnatural has just happened. "Damn it," Coulter muttered, nudging Ash forward. The terrain got rougher as he climbed. Deadfall blocked the game trails, forcing him to dismount and lead the horse through gaps between fallen timber. His boots slipped on loose shale. Sweat ran down his back beneath the heavy canvas shirt. He was starting to think he'd misjudged the distance when he smelled it. Gunpowder. Fresh. Then he saw her. She was standing in a small clearing maybe 30 yards ahead, her back to him, utterly still. Even from that distance, Coulter could see the dress, dark green fabric, or what had been dark green before it got torn and stained with dirt and what might have been blood. Her hair hung loose and tangled down her back. In her hands, held at an awkward angle like she wasn't quite sure what to do with it, was a Henry rifle. At her feet lay a man. Coulter's hand moved instinctively to the Colt at his hip, but he didn't draw. Not yet. He stepped carefully around a rotting log, trying to get a better angle on the scene. The man on the ground wasn't moving. His hat had fallen off, revealing thinning brown hair matted with sweat. There was blood spreading across his chest, dark and wet, soaking into the pine needles beneath him. The woman still hadn't moved. "Miss?" Coulter said, keeping his voice low and even. She spun around so fast she nearly dropped the rifle. Her face, Jesus. Her left eye was swollen almost shut, ringed with purple-black bruising that spread down to her cheekbone. Her lip was split. Scratches ran down her neck. And her eyes, those dark eyes, were so wide with terror that Coulter instinctively raised both hands to show he wasn't armed. "Easy," he said. "I'm not—" She ran, dropped the rifle right there in the dirt, and bolted into the trees like a spooked deer. The rifle clattered against a rock, and Coulter swore under his breath. He looked at the dead man again, definitely dead. The chest wound was too clean and too central to be anything else, then took off after her. She was fast. He'd give her that. Fear made people capable of things they wouldn't normally manage, and she was clearly running on pure adrenaline. But she was also exhausted and injured and wearing a dress that kept snagging on branches, while Coulter had spent years chasing down cattle through worse terrain than this. He caught up to her at a creek bed where the banks were too steep to scramble down quickly. She'd gotten maybe 100 yards before her legs gave out. When he came around the last stand of aspen, she was on her knees at the edge of the water, her whole body heaving with sobs that made no sound. That's when he realized. She wasn't just crying quietly. She literally couldn't make a sound. Coulter stopped a good 10 feet back, breathing hard. "Miss, I'm not going to hurt you." She twisted around to look at him, tears streaming down her bruised face, and tried to speak. Her mouth opened. Her throat worked. But nothing came out except a faint, strangled rasp that barely qualified as breath. "Okay," Coulter said, forcing his voice to stay calm even though his mind was racing through a dozen bad scenarios. "Okay, you don't have to talk, just stay there a second. Let me think." She pressed herself back against a boulder, watching him like he might lunge at any moment. Her dress was ripped at the shoulder, and now that he was closer, he could see the bruises on her arms. Finger marks. Someone had grabbed her hard enough to leave distinct prints. Coulter's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough violence in his life to recognize the signs, and what he was looking at made his stomach turn. "The man back there," he said carefully. "He dead?" She nodded, a quick jerky motion. "You shoot him?" Another nod. Then she squeezed her eyes shut like she was expecting him to pull his gun and finish what the other man had started. "Did he deserve it?" Her eyes snapped open. She stared at him for a long moment, then nodded again. Slower this time, but certain. Coulter exhaled. He took off his hat and wiped the sweat from his forehead, buying himself a few seconds to think. This was bad. This was the kind of bad that could get a person hanged if the story got told wrong. And out here in the territories, stories had a way of getting told however the people with power wanted them told. "All right," he said finally. "Here's what we're going to do. You're going to stay right there while I go back and take a look at the body, see if I can figure out who he was. Then we're going to talk about what happens next. That work for you?" She didn't move, didn't nod, just kept staring at him with those terrified eyes. "I'm not turning you in," Coulter added. "Not until I know the whole story. But I need you to trust me enough to stay put. Can you do that?" A long pause. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Good." Coulter settled his hat back on his head. "My name's Coulter Hayes. I work cattle for the Double J, about 12 miles south of here. I got no stake in whatever happened back there, except that I heard the shot and came to see if someone needed help. You understand?" Another nod. "All right then. Don't run off. I'll be back in 10 minutes. He didn't wait for a response. Just turned and headed back toward the clearing, half expecting to hear her crashing through the brush in the opposite direction the moment he was out of sight. But when he glanced back from the top of the rise, she was still there, huddled against the boulder like it was the only solid thing left in the world. The dead man looked even worse up close. Mid-40s, maybe. Rough clothes, the kind of cheap wool trousers and cotton shirt that working men wore when they couldn't afford anything better. His boots were scuffed and worn down at the heels. No gun belt, which was strange. The rifle the woman had dropped was the only weapon Coulter could see. He crouched down and checked the man's pockets. Found a folding knife, a few coins, and a scrap of paper with what looked like directions scrawled in pencil. No wallet, no identification. Nothing to say who he was or where he'd come from. The bullet wound was dead center in the chest. Close range, probably. The kind of shot you made when someone was right in front of you and you didn't have time to aim carefully. Self-defense, most likely. Especially given the state of the woman. Coulter stood up and looked around the clearing. There were signs of a struggle, scuffed dirt, broken branches, the rifle lying where she'd dropped it. And there, near the base of a large pine, he spotted something that made his blood run cold. Rope, heavy hemp rope, cut through in the middle, the frayed end still tied to the tree trunk. She'd been tied up. "Jesus Christ," Coulter muttered. He walked over and examined the rope more closely. The knots were tight, professional. Whoever had tied her up knew what they were doing, and judging by the bark scraped off the tree at about shoulder height, she'd struggled hard enough to leave marks. This wasn't a random attack. This was planned. Coulter gathered up the rope and the rifle, then headed back toward the creek. The woman was exactly where he'd left her, which surprised him more than it probably should have. She watched him approach with that same wary terror, but she didn't run. He stopped about 15 feet away and set the rifle down on a flat rock. Then he held up the rope so she could see it. "This yours?" Her face went white. She nodded. "He tie you to that tree?" Another nod. Her hands were shaking again. Coulter tossed the rope aside. He's the only one? No one else out here? She hesitated, then shook her head. But there was something uncertain in the gesture, like she wasn't completely sure. All right, we need to figure out what to do here, and I need more information than yes or no. You able to write? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She blinked, then nodded. Coulter dug into his saddlebag. He'd left ash tied up near the clearing and pulled out a stub of pencil and a folded piece of paper he'd been using to track the cattle he was supposed to be finding. He walked over slowly and held them out to her. She stared at the pencil like it might bite her. I'm not going to hurt you, Coulter said quietly. I just need to understand what happened. She took the pencil with trembling fingers. Her hands were bruised too, he noticed, defensive wounds on her knuckles. She'd fought hard. She pressed the paper against her knee and wrote in shaky letters. My name is Evelyn Whitmore. Coulter read it and felt his stomach drop. Whitmore? As in Judge Nathaniel Whitmore? She looked up at him, surprised, then nodded. Hell! Coulter ran a hand through his hair. Judge Whitmore was one of the most powerful men in the territory. He'd made enemies putting away claim jumpers and crooked mine operators, and there'd been talk for months about threats against his family. Coulter had heard some of it in the bunkhouse, though he'd mostly tuned it out because it wasn't his business. Until now. You're his daughter, Coulter said. It wasn't really a question. Evelyn nodded. She bent over the paper again and wrote, They took me 3 weeks ago. Wanted my father to change a ruling. He wouldn't. 3 weeks. Jesus. Coulter looked at her bruised face, her torn dress, the hollow exhaustion in her eyes, and felt a surge of anger so intense he had to look away for a moment. The man back there, he said when he trusted himself to speak. He one of them? She nodded. How many total? She held up 4 fingers, then crossed one out. 3 left then. And they just... What? Left him here with you? Evelyn's face went hard. She wrote quickly. He wanted to... She stopped, crossed it out, started again. He tried to hurt me. I got the rifle. He didn't think I would shoot. Coulter looked at her for a long moment. But you did. Yes. Good, he said, and meant it. Some of the tension went out of her shoulders. She looked at him like she was trying to decide if he was real or if this was some kind of trick. The other 3, Coulter said. They coming back? I don't know. They rode out yesterday morning, said they'd be gone 2 days. Maybe longer. That gave them time, at least. Not much, but some. Coulter made a decision. It wasn't a particularly smart decision, and he knew it was going to complicate his life in ways he couldn't predict. But looking at this terrified woman who'd survived 3 weeks of hell and still had the strength to fight back, he couldn't see any other choice. All right, he said. Here's what we're going to do. My camp's about 3 miles east of here, tucked up in a box canyon where nobody's going to stumble across it. We'll head there, get you cleaned up and fed, and tomorrow we'll ride for Red Hollow. There's a sheriff there, Boone Mercer. He's a decent man, far as I know. We'll get you under his protection and send word to your father. Evelyn stared at him, then wrote, Why are you helping me? Coulter shrugged. Don't seem right to leave you out here. You could get killed. Yeah, well. He picked up the Henry rifle and checked the chamber, still loaded. Wouldn't be the first time somebody tried. She wrote, You don't know me. Don't need to, Coulter said. You're in trouble. I can help. That's enough. For the first time since he'd found her, something that might have been hope flickered across Evelyn's face. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing dirt across her cheek, and nodded. Can you ride? Coulter asked. She nodded again. Good. Let's get moving before those other bastards decide to come back early. Cheers. The ride to Coulter's camp took longer than it should have. Evelyn was exhausted and hurting, and even though she couldn't complain, Coulter could see her swaying in the saddle. He'd put her on Ash, who was steady and patient, while he walked ahead leading the horse and watching for any sign of pursuit. The sun was starting to sink behind the western peaks when they finally reached the box canyon. It was a good spot, the kind of place Coulter had learned to look for during his years of drifting. A narrow entrance that could be defended if needed, a spring-fed pool for water, enough grass for the horses, and high rock walls that blocked the wind and hid the smoke from a campfire. He helped Evelyn down from the saddle. She was so stiff she could barely stand, and when her legs buckled, he caught her without thinking. She flinched at the contact, and he let go immediately, stepping back. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to." She shook her head quickly and made a gesture that seemed to mean it's fine, but her hands were trembling again. Coulter busied himself with the horses, giving her space. He unsaddled Ash and hobbled both animals near the grass, then dug through his pack for the supplies he'd need. His camp was sparse: a bedroll, a canvas tarp he could rig up as a lean-to if it rained, some basic cooking gear. He'd been planning to head back to the ranch in another day or two, so his food stores were running low. Beans, coffee, some jerky, a little cornmeal. Enough for 2 people for a day, maybe. When he looked back, Evelyn was sitting on a flat rock near the spring, staring at her reflection in the water. Even in the fading light, he could see the bruises clearly. The damage to her face made her look older than she probably was. Early 20s, he guessed. Young. Too young for what she'd been through. He built a fire in the ring of stones he'd set up the first night he'd camped here, then filled his battered coffee pot from the spring and set it to boil. Evelyn watched him work but didn't move. She looked like she was afraid that if she moved, she might shatter. "You should drink some water," Coulter said, nodding toward the spring. "And wash up if you want. I'll turn around." She looked at him, then at the water, then back at him. After a long pause, she nodded. Coulter turned his back and focused on the fire. Behind him, he heard the soft sounds of her moving around, fabric rustling, water splashing. He kept his eyes on the flames and tried not to think too hard about what those men had done to her. Tried not to imagine her tied to that tree for days, or the things that happened before she got the chance to grab the rifle. When she finally made a small sound to let him know she was done, he turned back around. She'd washed the worst of the dirt off her face and hands, though the bruises looked even more livid against her clean skin. She'd also tried to pin her hair back with what looked like a piece of torn cloth. It didn't really work, but the effort seemed to have calmed her a little. Coulter handed her a tin cup of water. She took it carefully, like she wasn't quite sure if it was real. "Drink slow," he said. "You're probably dehydrated." She did, taking small sips while watching him over the rim of the cup. When she finished, she set it down and gestured for the pencil and paper again. He handed them over. "Thank you," she wrote. "Don't mention it." "I don't understand why you're doing this." Coulter shrugged. "Told you already. You needed help. Most people would have left me there." She paused, then added, "Or worse." "Yeah, well..." He poured himself some coffee, even though it was barely drinkable yet. "I ain't most people." She studied him for a long moment, and Coulter had the uncomfortable feeling of being assessed, measured. He wasn't used to that kind of attention, especially from someone like her. Even bruised and exhausted and wearing a torn dress, she had a quality about her that spoke of education and refinement. The way she held the pencil, the precise shape of her letters. This was a woman who'd grown up in a world completely different from his. "How far is Red Hollow?" she wrote. 2 days hard ride. Maybe 3 if we take it easier, which we probably should, given..." He gestured vaguely at her injuries. "Will the sheriff believe me?" "About what happened? I expect so. Your father's got a reputation, and folks have been talking about the threats for weeks now. Plus, you've got me to back up your story. You don't know what happened." "I know enough," Coulter said. "And I trust what I saw back there." She looked down at the paper and wrote something, then crossed it out. Wrote something else. Crossed that out too. Finally, she just sat there, pencil hovering over the page, struggling with something. "You don't have to explain anything," Coulter said quietly. "Not tonight. Maybe not ever if you don't want to." She looked up at him, and for a second he thought she might cry again. Instead, she wrote, "My voice. It doesn't work anymore. I noticed. One of them. The first week. She stopped. Started again. "He choked me. I thought I was going to die. When I woke up, I couldn't speak. Haven't been able to since." Coulter felt that anger surge up again, hot and sharp. "He's still alive?" She nodded. "Good," he said grimly. "Then there's a chance he'll hang for it. My father will make sure of it." "I believe that." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the fire crackle and the horses shifting in the darkness. Coulter heated up some beans and hardtack, dividing it between them. It wasn't much, but Evelyn ate like she hadn't seen food in days. She probably hadn't, or not much anyway. When they finished, Coulter rigged up the canvas tarp as a lean-to near the fire and spread out his bedroll underneath it. "You take this," he said. "I'll sleep over by the horses." She immediately started to protest, gesturing at the bedroll and then at him. "I've slept in worse places," Coulter said. "You need the rest more than I do. Besides, I'll be able to hear better if anyone comes up the canyon." She looked like she wanted to argue, but exhaustion was winning. She wrote, "You're sure?" "Positive. Now get some sleep. We've got a long ride ahead of us." Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. She crawled into the bedroll and pulled the blanket up to her chin, watching him as he moved back toward the fire. Even from across the camp, he could see her fighting to keep her eyes open. Within minutes, her breathing had evened out. Coulter sat by the fire for a long time after that, listening to the night sounds and thinking about everything that had just gotten complicated in his life. He should have walked away, should have let someone else deal with Judge Whitmore's daughter and the mess she'd brought with her. Getting involved in this kind of thing never ended well for men like him, men with no money, no connections, no leverage against the kind of people who hired kidnappers and made judges' families disappear. But when he looked over at the lean-to and saw her sleeping there, small and broken, and trusting him to keep her safe, he knew he'd made the only choice he could live with. So he checked his rifle one more time, fed another log to the fire, and settled in for a long night of watching the canyon entrance and hoping like hell that those 3 remaining kidnappers were still wherever they'd gone and not on their way back. The wilderness was quiet. The stars were bright. And for the first time in years, Coulter Hayes felt responsible for something more than finding stray cattle. He wasn't sure yet if that was a good thing or not. Dawn came cold and gray, the kind of morning that made Coulter's joints ache and reminded him he wasn't getting any younger. He'd dozed off sometime around 3, sitting up against a rock with his rifle across his knees, and woke to find frost coating the grass and his breath misting in the air. The fire had burned down to embers. Evelyn was still asleep in the bedroll, curled into a tight ball under the blanket. He could see her shoulders rising and falling with each breath, steady and even. Good. She needed the rest. Coulter stood slowly, working the stiffness out of his legs, and walked over to check on the horses. Ash nickered softly when he approached, nosing at his pocket looking for the sugar cubes Coulter didn't have. He scratched the gelding's neck and whispered, "Yeah, I know. We're all out of the good stuff." The canyon was quiet except for the burble of the spring and the occasional call of a bird. No sign of anyone approaching. That was something, at least. He rebuilt the fire and got coffee going, then rationed out the last of the cornmeal to make a thin porridge. It wasn't much, but it would give them something in their stomachs before the ride. He was stirring the pot when he heard movement behind him. Evelyn had emerged from the lean-to, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her hair was a mess, and her face looked worse in the morning light. The bruises had deepened overnight to ugly shades of purple and yellow, but her eyes were clearer than they'd been the night before, more alert. She saw him looking and pulled the blanket tighter, suddenly self-conscious. "Morning," Coulter said. "Coffee's almost ready. Food too, though I won't pretend it's going to be good." She nodded and moved to sit on the same rock as last night, keeping the blanket wrapped around herself. Her feet were bare and filthy, he noticed. Those fancy shoes she'd been wearing when they took her were probably long gone. Coulter poured coffee into both tin cups and handed one to her. She took it with both hands, holding it close to her face and breathing in the steam. For a moment she just sat like that, eyes closed, and Coulter wondered when the last time was that she'd had something as simple as hot coffee. When she opened her eyes, she gestured for the pencil and paper. He passed them over. "How long until we leave?" she wrote. "Soon as we eat and I get the horses ready. Hour, maybe." She nodded, then wrote, "The men. If they come back to that clearing, they'll find the body," Coulter finished. "Yeah, I've been thinking about that. Best case, they figure you wandered off and died somewhere. Worst case, they start tracking you. Us." He looked at the word on the paper, then at her. "Yeah, us. I'm sorry." "For what?" "Getting you involved in this." Coulter shrugged. "I involved myself. You didn't ask for my help." "You should have left me there." "No," he said flatly. "I shouldn't have." She stared at him for a long moment, then looked away. Wrote, "You don't know what they'll do if they catch us. I got a pretty good idea, which is why we're not going to get caught." You're very confident for someone who doesn't know what he's up against. And you're very worried for someone who just shot one of them dead, Coulter said. He didn't mean it harshly, but Evelyn flinched anyway. He softened his tone. Look, I'm not saying this is going to be easy, but we've got a head start, and I know these mountains better than most. We stick to the high country, move fast, and we'll make Red Hollow before they even know which direction to look. She wanted to believe him. He could see it in her face, but 3 weeks of captivity had taught her not to trust anything that sounded too certain. They ate the porridge in silence. It tasted like paste, but Evelyn finished every bite. While she was eating, Coulter went to check his saddlebags and realized they had a problem. You got any shoes? He called over his shoulder. Evelyn shook her head. Thought not. He dug through his pack and came up with a spare pair of wool socks, thick and relatively clean. These'll help some, but you can't ride 2 days barefoot. We'll need to stop somewhere and see about getting you boots. She wrote, Where? There's a trading post about halfway to Red Hollow, place called Clement's Station. Old man who runs it doesn't ask questions, which is going to work in our favor. Will he have boots? He's got everything. Probably overcharge us for it, but that's the price of doing business in the middle of nowhere. Evelyn looked down at her torn dress, her bare feet, the bruises covering her arms. She wrote, You look like someone who's been through hell, Coulter said quietly. Which you have. Clement's seen worse. He won't care. She didn't look convinced, but she pulled on the wool socks anyway. They were too big for her, bunching up around her ankles, but they were better than nothing. Coulter saddled both horses and helped Evelyn up onto Ash. She was sore and stiff, moving like every muscle hurt, which it probably did. He handed her the reins and swung up onto the second horse, a rangy bay mare he'd borrowed from the Double J with the vague promise of returning her eventually. We'll take it slow, he said. Let me know if you need to stop. Evelyn nodded. Then, impulsively, she reached out and touched his arm. When he looked at her, she mouthed 2 words. Thank you. Coulter nodded and turned his horse toward the canyon entrance. Let's go. They rode east through country that got rougher with every mile. The trails Coulter chose were barely trails at all, game paths that wound between deadfall and granite outcrops, following the contours of the mountainside in ways that made no sense unless you knew where you were going. Evelyn followed without complaint, though he could see her gripping the saddle horn whenever the path got particularly steep. Around midday, they stopped at a creek to water the horses and rest. Evelyn slid down from the saddle and immediately sat on the ground, her legs shaking. Coulter filled his canteen and brought it over to her. You doing all right? She made a so-so gesture with her hand. We can rest longer if you need. She shook her head and reached for the pencil. How much farther to Clement's? 4, maybe 5 hours if we keep this pace. She looked at the sky, judging the time, then wrote, We should keep moving. You sure? Yes. Coulter studied her face. She was pale and there were dark circles under her eyes, but her jaw was set with determination. He'd seen that look before on wounded animals that refused to quit. It usually meant they were running on spite and stubbornness, which worked until it didn't. All right, he said, but we're stopping at Clement's for the night. I don't care if you think you can keep going. She started to protest, but he cut her off. You're hurt and exhausted, and I'm not dragging your unconscious body into Red Hollow because you pushed too hard. We rest at Clement's. That's not negotiable. Evelyn glared at him, then wrote, You're very bossy. Yeah, well, somebody's gotta be. Despite everything, the corner of her mouth twitched, almost a smile. They mounted up again and continued east. The sun climbed higher, beating down through the thin mountain air. Coulter kept watching their back trail, looking for any sign of pursuit, but the wilderness behind them remained empty. That should have been reassuring. Somehow, it just made him more nervous. Late in the afternoon, as they were crossing a high meadow dotted with wildflowers, Evelyn made a small sound. Coulter turned in the saddle and saw her staring at something off to the left. He followed her gaze and saw what had caught her attention. A cluster of blue columbines growing near a fallen log, their delicate petals moving slightly in the breeze. She was looking at them like she'd forgotten flowers existed. You want to stop? Coulter asked. She hesitated, then shook her head, but she kept looking back at the flowers until they were out of sight. An hour later, they crested a ridge and Coulter pointed to a thin column of smoke rising in the distance. Clement's Station, We'll be there before dark." Evelyn sagged slightly in the saddle, relief evident in every line of her body. The trading post appeared gradually as they descended the far side of the ridge. First the smoke, then the roof, then the whole structure coming into view. It wasn't much to look at. A squat log building with a covered porch, a corral out back, and a lean-to stable that had seen better days. But it was civilization of a sort, and right now that was enough. An old man was sitting on the porch, whittling something from a piece of pine. He looked up as they approached, his eyes sharp despite the weathered face and white beard. This was Silas Clement, who'd been running this post for 20 years and had probably seen every kind of trouble the territory could produce. "Coulter Hayes," Silas said, not getting up. "Thought you were working the Double J." "Was. Got sidetracked." Coulter dismounted and helped Evelyn down. She swayed when her feet hit the ground, and he steadied her with a hand on her elbow. Silas took in Evelyn's appearance, the bruises, the torn dress, the bare feet in oversized socks, and his expression didn't change at all. "Looks like quite a sidetrack." "She needs boots," Coulter said, "and we need a place to sleep tonight. You got space?" "Might. Depends on whether you're bringing trouble with you." "Might be," Coulter admitted. "Won't know for sure until tomorrow." Silas nodded slowly, still whittling. "That gonna be a problem for me?" "Not if we're gone at first light." "Fair enough." Silas stood, pocketing his knife and the half-carved figure. "Boots first, then we'll talk about sleeping arrangements. Bring her inside." The trading post was dim and cluttered, every surface covered with goods of varying usefulness. Traps hung from the ceiling. Sacks of flour and beans lined one wall. There were tin pans, ammunition boxes, bolts of fabric, jars of preserved fruit, coils of rope, and at least 3 different kinds of patent medicine that Coulter was pretty sure didn't actually cure anything. Silas disappeared into the back and emerged with several pairs of boots. "Try these. They're men's, but small. Might fit if we stuff the toes." Evelyn sat on a stool and pulled on the first pair. Too big. The second pair was closer, and with some extra socks they actually worked. She stood and took a few experimental steps, then nodded. "How much?" Coulter asked. $3. Yents. It was highway robbery, but Coulter had expected as much. He dug into his pocket and counted out the coins. "We need supplies too. Coffee, beans, jerky, whatever you can spare." "Gonna cost you." I figured. While Silas was gathering the supplies, Evelyn wandered over to a shelf near the window. She picked up a small hand mirror, dusty and tarnished, and looked at her reflection. Coulter saw her face change as she took in the full extent of the bruising. She set the mirror down quickly, like it had burned her. Silas came back with a burlap sack of provisions. "That'll be another $4. And if you want the room upstairs, it's $1 for the night." Coulter paid without arguing. His funds were getting low, but they'd manage. "There's a pump out back," Silas said to Evelyn, "and some soap if you want to clean up. I'll heat water for coffee." Evelyn looked at Coulter, who nodded. "Go ahead. I'll take care of the horses." She grabbed the pencil from Coulter's pocket and wrote quickly, "Don't leave." "I won't. I'll be right outside." She held his gaze for a moment, making sure he meant it, then headed for the back door. Silas waited until she was gone, then said quietly, "What'd you get yourself into?" "Nothing I couldn't walk away from." "But you didn't." "No," Coulter said. "I didn't." Silas nodded, like that explained everything. "She got a name?" "She does, but I'm not giving it to you." "Fair enough." The old man moved to the stove and started working on the coffee. "She can't talk?" "Not since someone tried to strangle her." Silas's hands paused just for a second, then continued their work. "People who did that, they still breathing? 3 of them are. They gonna come looking?" "Maybe." "You got a plan for if they do?" Coulter leaned against the counter, suddenly feeling every mile they'd ridden. "Working on it." Silas poured coffee into 2 cups and slid one across to Coulter. "You know, most men would have kept riding, found some cattle, went back to the ranch, pretended they never heard that gunshot." "Yeah. So why didn't you?" Coulter wrapped his hands around the hot cup and considered the question. "Guess I got tired of pretending I don't see things that are right in front of me." "That's a dangerous way to live." "Living any way is dangerous," Coulter said. "At least this way I can look at myself in the mirror." Silas snorted. "Mirrors are overrated." But there was approval in his eyes. They drank their coffee in silence. Outside, Coulter could hear Evelyn working the pump, the squeak and splash of water. He found himself listening to make sure the sounds continued, that she was still there and safe. "Room upstairs has 2 beds," Silas said eventually, "and a bolt on the door. I'll be down here all night if anything happens." "Appreciate it. Don't mention it. Just don't bleed on my floor if those men show up." "I'll do my best." When Evelyn came back inside, she looked slightly more put together. She'd washed the dirt from her face and arms and somehow managed to pin her hair back more securely. The bruises stood out starkly against her clean skin, but there was color in her cheeks that hadn't been there before. Silas ladled stew into 2 bowls, actual stew with meat and vegetables, not the thin gruel Coulter had been living on, and set them on the small table near the stove. "Eat, both of you. You look half-starved." They didn't need to be told twice. Evelyn ate slowly, like her stomach had shrunk, but she finished the whole bowl. Coulter went back for seconds. "Room's upstairs, first door on the left," Silas said when they were done. "Blankets are clean, more or less." Coulter nodded and stood, picking up his rifle and saddlebags. Evelyn followed him up the narrow stairs to a small room that held 2 cots, a washstand, and nothing else. It was clean enough, though the whole place smelled like wood smoke and old leather. Evelyn sat on one of the cots and immediately pulled out the pencil and paper. "He seems trustworthy." "Silas? Yeah, he's all right. Known him a few years. He won't ask questions." "What if those men come here looking?" "Then Silas will tell them he hasn't seen anything, and they'll move on." Coulter set his rifle against the wall. "He's not going to hand you over." "How do you know?" "Because he's that kind of person. There aren't many of us left, but we look out for each other." She studied him in the dim light from the window. "You keep saying us. Who are you talking about?" "People who've got no place else to go," Coulter said. "People who ended up out here because the world didn't want them anywhere else." "Is that why you're here?" He shrugged. "Part of it." "What's the other part?" "That's a longer story. We have time." Coulter sat on the other cot and pulled off his boots. "You should get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be even longer than today." But Evelyn didn't lie down. She kept watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes, waiting. Finally, he sighed. "All right. You want the story? I came west after the war. Didn't have much left back east. My parents were dead, the farm was gone, and I'd seen enough of fighting to last a lifetime. Thought maybe out here things would be different, simpler." "Were they?" "In some ways. In others, no. Turns out people are the same everywhere. Just the scenery changes." "Why cattle?" "Needed work. Cattle don't judge you for your past. They just need someone who knows which end bites and which end kicks." Despite everything, that almost got a smile out of her. She wrote, "Do you like it?" "It's honest work. Keeps me moving. That's enough most days." "Most days?" He looked at her. "Yeah, most days." She held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. Wrote, "Thank you for telling me. Don't know why you'd want to know anything about me. Because you're risking your life for mine. I think I deserve to know who you are." "Fair point." Coulter stood and moved to the window, looking out at the gathering darkness. "Your turn. Who's Evelyn Whitmore when she's not being held captive by criminals?" She hesitated, then began writing. The story came out in short, fragmentary sentences. She was 24, lived in Denver with her father. Her mother had died when she was young. She'd been educated at a finishing school back east, studying literature and music. She'd come home to help her father with his work, organizing his case files and attending social functions where she could keep her ears open for useful information. "I was going to a meeting with some wives of mining executives," she wrote. "Father thought I might hear something relevant to his case. I never made it. 3 men grabbed me off the street 2 blocks from my house, threw me in a wagon. By the time I woke up, we were in the mountains." Coulter read the words and felt that anger building again. "Your father. You know what happened? They made me write him a letter. Said if he ruled against the mining company, they'd send me back in pieces." "Jesus." He wrote back. Said he couldn't compromise the law, even for me. She paused, then added, "I was proud of him. And terrified." "That's when they started hurting you?" She nodded, wrote, "They wanted me to beg, to write again and say I was scared. I wouldn't do it. So they tried to make you." "Yes." Coulter turned from the window. The man who choked you. What's his name? Vincent. I don't know his last name. He was the leader. And the other two? Carter and Webb. They're brothers. Younger. They did whatever Vincent told them. The man you shot. Was he one of them? No. His name was Pike. He was hired later, just for... She stopped, crossed it out. He wasn't part of the original plan. But he knew what they'd done to you. Yes. And he decided to make it worse. She didn't respond. Didn't need to. Coulter sat back down on the cot, suddenly exhausted. I'm going to make sure they pay for this. All of them. It's not your responsibility. Maybe not, but I'm making it mine. She looked at him for a long time, then wrote, Why? It was the same question Silas had asked. Coulter gave her the same answer. Because somebody should. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. She wiped them away quickly, angrily, like she was mad at herself for crying. When she had control again, she wrote, No one's ever... She stopped, started over. Most people wouldn't. Most people are cowards. You're not. I'm just stubborn, Coulter said. There's a difference. She shook her head. No, you're good. You don't want to admit it, but you are. That made him uncomfortable. He stood and moved back to the window. Get some sleep. We leave at first light. This time she didn't argue. She lay down on the cot, still fully dressed, and pulled the thin blanket over herself. Within minutes, her breathing had slowed. Coulter stayed by the window, watching the darkness and thinking about what tomorrow would bring. Red Hollow was a full day's hard ride from here, maybe more depending on how Evelyn held up. They'd need to push through without stopping, which meant she'd be in pain and exhausted by the time they arrived. But once they made it to Sheriff Mercer, she'd be safe, protected. She could send word to her father and let him handle the rest. And Coulter could go back to his life. Back to the cattle and the drifting and the carefully maintained solitude that had served him well enough for 10 years. The thought should have been comforting. Instead, it sat in his chest like a stone. Outside, something moved in the shadows near the corral. Coulter's hand went to his rifle, but it was just one of the horses shifting position. He forced himself to relax. It was going to be a long night. He must have dozed off at some point because he woke with a start to find pale gray light seeping through the window. Evelyn was still asleep, curled into a tight ball under the blanket. Coulter stood quietly and stretched, working out the kinks from sleeping half-sitting against the wall. Downstairs, he found Silas already up and moving around, coffee brewing on the stove. Quiet night, the old man said. Nope. No visitors. Good. Coulter accepted the cup of coffee Silas handed him. We'll be moving out soon. Figured. I packed some extra jerky in your supplies. Don't argue, you already paid for it. Silas? I said don't argue. The old man fixed him with a stern look. That girl needs every advantage you can give her. The jerky's nothing. Coulter nodded, accepting the gesture for what it was. Thank you. Just keep her alive, that'll be thanks enough. When Evelyn came downstairs, Silas had breakfast ready. Eggs and fried bread, simple but filling. They ate quickly, neither of them talking. The silence felt heavy with everything that lay ahead. Coulter settled up with Silas, then went to saddle the horses. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of day that promised heat later. Good weather for traveling, at least. Evelyn appeared with her new boots and the oversized socks, looking more prepared than she had yesterday. Silas handed her a small cloth bundle. Bandages and salve, he said gruffly, for those bruises. Might help, might not, but it won't hurt. Evelyn's eyes went wide. She pulled out the pencil and wrote, Thank you. Silas waved it off. Get going, and Coulter, watch your back. Always do. They mounted up and headed east again, leaving Clement's station behind. The sun was just clearing the peaks when Evelyn pulled her horse alongside Coulter's and handed him a note. That man, Silas. He was kind. Yeah, he is. There are good people out here. Coulter looked at her, seeing something in her face that hadn't been there before. Not quite hope, but maybe the beginning of it. Yeah, he said quietly. There are. They rode on through the morning, the trail winding higher into country that grew progressively more wild and beautiful. And with every mile, Coulter became more aware that he wasn't just protecting her anymore. He was starting to care what happened to her beyond just keeping her alive. That was dangerous. That was complicated. That was probably going to break his heart. But he kept riding anyway. By midday, they'd climbed high enough that patches of old snow still clung to the shadowed ravines, and the air had turned thin and sharp in Coulter's lungs. The trail here was little more than a suggestion carved by elk and mountain goats, winding along ridge lines that dropped away into nothing on both sides. Evelyn rode behind him without complaint, though he could see her knuckles white on the reins whenever they crossed a particularly narrow stretch. They stopped to rest the horses near a creek that tumbled down from the snowpack above. Coulter filled the canteens while Evelyn sat on a flat rock, her face turned up toward the sun. She'd pulled off the borrowed jacket Silas had thrown in with the supplies, and now she just sat there breathing like she was trying to remember what clean air tasted like. When Coulter came back with the water, she was writing something. She held it up for him to see. I forgot how beautiful it could be. Out here. Yeah, Coulter said, looking at the peaks rising around them, snow-capped and ancient. It's something. When they kept me in that camp, I couldn't see anything. Just trees and dirt in their faces. Coulter handed her a canteen. You don't have to think about that right now. I can't stop thinking about it. He sat down on a nearby rock, giving her space but staying close enough to talk. That's normal, I expect. You went through hell. That doesn't just disappear because you got away. She looked at him, surprised, then wrote, Most people would tell me to forget about it. Move on. Most people are idiots. That got a real smile out of her, small but genuine. She took a drink of water and stared out at the valley below them. After a moment, she wrote, How much farther? Red Hollow? We'll make it by nightfall if we don't stop too long. Town's on the other side of that ridge. He pointed to a line of peaks in the distance. What's the sheriff like? Boone Mercer? He's solid. Been lawman in Red Hollow for 8, maybe 9 years. Used to be a marshal down in New Mexico before he got tired of chasing outlaws and decided to settle somewhere quieter. Is Red Hollow quiet? Compared to some places, yeah. It's a mining town, so you get the usual trouble. Drunks, fights, claim disputes. But Mercer keeps a lid on it. He won't let anything happen to you. Evelyn nodded slowly, then wrote, And after? When my father comes? Coulter stood and walked to the edge of the creek, watching the water rush over smooth stones. After, you go home to Denver, back to your life. What about you? I go back to mine. Working cattle. That's the plan. She was quiet for so long that he turned around to see if something was wrong. She was staring at the paper in her lap, the pencil hovering over it like she wanted to write something but couldn't figure out how to put it into words. Finally, she just wrote, That seems lonely. Coulter shrugged. I'm used to it. That doesn't mean it's good. He didn't have an answer for that, so he changed the subject. We should get moving. Want to make the ridge before the afternoon storms roll in. Evelyn looked like she wanted to argue, but she stood and walked back to her horse. Coulter helped her into the saddle. She was still sore and stiff, though she tried to hide it, and they set off again. The trail got worse as they climbed. Loose scree made the horses pick their way carefully, and twice Coulter had to dismount and lead Ash across sections where one wrong step would send them both tumbling down the mountainside. Evelyn followed his example, walking when he walked, trusting his judgment about where to put her feet. They were crossing a particularly nasty stretch of rockfall when she slipped. One moment she was right behind him, the next she was sliding backward, boots scraping against loose stone, her hand losing its grip on the reins. Coulter dropped Ash's lead rope and lunged for her, catching her wrist just as she went over the edge. For a second they hung there, Coulter on his stomach on the trail, and Evelyn dangling halfway down a steep slope scattered with jagged rocks. Her eyes were huge with terror. I got you, Coulter said through gritted teeth. Don't let go. Her other hand came up and grabbed his forearm, her nails digging into his skin. Slowly, carefully, he hauled her back up until she could get her feet under her and scramble onto solid ground. They ended up in a heap at the edge of the trail, both breathing hard. Evelyn's whole body was shaking. She tried to pull away from him, but her legs wouldn't support her weight. Coulter kept one arm around her shoulders, holding her steady. You're all right, he said quietly. You're safe. She nodded against his chest, still trembling. When she finally had enough control to move, she pulled back and looked at him. Her face was pale and her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. She reached for the pencil with shaking hands. Thank you, she wrote. Then, after a pause, again, You don't need to keep thanking me. Yes, I do. You keep saving my life. Well, stop trying to fall off mountains and I won't have to. She actually laughed at that, a silent, breathy sound that shook her shoulders. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh, even without sound, and something about it hit him harder than it should have. They sat there for a minute, letting their hearts slow down before Coulter stood and offered her his hand. Come on, let's get off this damn ridge before it kills both of us. The rest of the climb went slower. Coulter kept Evelyn in front of him now where he could grab her if she slipped again, and he chose each step twice as carefully as before. By the time they crested the ridge and started down the far side, the sun was well past its peak and heading toward the western horizon. Red Hollow appeared in the valley below them like something out of a fever dream. It was bigger than Coulter remembered. The mine had clearly brought in more people since his last visit. The main street was lined with false-fronted buildings, and he could see the skeletal framework of new construction going up at the far end of town. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys. Even from this distance, he could hear the distant clang of the stamp mill crushing ore. Evelyn stared at the town like she wasn't sure it was real. How many people? She wrote. Maybe 400, 500? Hard to say. Population goes up and down depending on whether the mine's hiring. That's a lot of witnesses. That's the idea. Once we get you to Mercer's office, you'll be safe. Those men won't risk coming into town and causing trouble with that many people around. She didn't look entirely convinced, but she nodded. They descended into the valley as the shadows grew long and the temperature started to drop. By the time they reached the outskirts of Red Hollow, lamps were being lit in windows and the saloons were starting to fill with miners done with their shifts. Coulter led them straight down the main street toward the sheriff's office, ignoring the stares that followed them. He knew what they looked like, a rough cowboy and a bruised woman in torn clothes riding in from the wilderness. People would talk. Let them. The sheriff's office was a solid stone building with bars on the windows and a sign that needed repainting. Coulter dismounted and tied both horses to the rail, then helped Evelyn down. Her legs nearly buckled again, and he caught her elbow. Easy. Almost there. She nodded and let him steady her as they walked up the steps. Coulter pushed open the door. The office was warm and smelled like coffee and old tobacco. A man sat at a desk near the back, writing something in a ledger. He looked up when they entered, and Coulter saw his eyes narrow as he took in Evelyn's appearance. Boone Mercer was in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and a mustache that drooped past his chin. He'd been a hard man once. You could see it in the scars on his knuckles and the way he moved, but age and civilization had worn some of the edges off. He stood slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun on his hip, before he recognized Coulter. "Hayes," he said. "Didn't expect to see you in town." "Didn't expect to be here," Coulter said. "We've got a situation." Mercer's eyes went to Evelyn, who was standing very still beside Coulter like she was trying to decide whether to trust this new stranger. The sheriff's expression softened slightly. "Miss," he said, nodding to her, then back to Coulter. "What kind of situation?" "The kind that needs privacy." Mercer studied them both for a moment, then gestured toward a door at the back of the office. "Conference room. Give me a minute." He disappeared through the door, and Coulter heard him speaking to someone. A deputy, probably. When Mercer came back, he was alone. "Come on back. Both of you." The conference room was small and windowless, with a scarred table and 4 chairs. Mercer lit a lamp and closed the door behind them. "All right, talk." Coulter looked at Evelyn, who nodded. He turned back to Mercer. "Sheriff, this is Evelyn Whitmore, Judge Nathaniel Whitmore's daughter from Denver." Mercer went very still. "The hell you say?" "She was kidnapped 3 weeks ago by men trying to force the judge to throw a mining case. I found her 2 days ago in the mountains. She'd just shot one of her captors in self-defense." The sheriff pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. "Jesus Christ." He looked at Evelyn. "Miss Whitmore, is this true?" Evelyn reached for the pencil and paper Coulter handed her. She wrote quickly, "Yes. Everything he said is true. There were 4 men. I killed one. 3 are still out there." Mercer read the note, then looked at Coulter. "She can't speak? One of them damaged her throat. She communicates through writing. Can you tell me what happened, all of it?" Evelyn's hand shook slightly, but she started writing. The story came out in fragments. The abduction, the camp in the mountains, the threats against her father, the weeks of captivity. She didn't include everything, Coulter could tell, but she gave Mercer enough to understand the scope of what had been done to her. When she finished, Mercer sat back in his chair and exhaled slowly. I'll need names, descriptions, anything you can give me. Evelyn wrote, Vincent, the leader. I don't know his last name, dark hair, scar on his left cheek, about 40. Carter and Webb, brothers, both in their 20s, blonde hair. The dead man was named Pike. I don't know anything else about him. And the mining case. You know which one? Something about land rights. A company called Mountain Star Consolidated. They wanted my father to rule in their favor. He refused. Mercer nodded slowly. I've heard of them. Big operation out of Denver. A lot of money behind it. He looked at Coulter. Where'd you find the body? High country, maybe 20 miles west of Clement Station. I can show you on a map. We'll need to recover it, and I'll need to send telegrams. One to your father in Denver, Miss Whitmore, and one to the territorial marshal. This is bigger than I can handle alone. Evelyn wrote, How long until my father can get here? Depends on whether he's in Denver or out on circuit. If he's home, could be as quick as 3 days. If he's traveling, could be a week. Her face fell. A week seemed like an eternity. In the meantime, Mercer said, you'll stay here. We've got a room in the back with a cot. It's not fancy, but it's secure. No one gets in or out without going through me or my deputies. What about Coulter? What about him? He saved my life more than once. I want him to stay. Mercer looked at Coulter with new interest. That true? I did what anyone would have done. No, Mercer said flatly. Most people would have walked the other way. You got somewhere to be, Hayes, or can you stick around for a few days? Coulter thought about the Double J Ranch waiting for him to come back with cattle he'd never found. Thought about the simple, uncomplicated life he'd been living before he heard that gunshot in the forest. Then he looked at Evelyn, who was watching him with those dark eyes that had seen too much suffering. I can stay, he said. Relief flooded her face. Mercer stood. All right, I'll get those telegrams sent tonight. Hayes, there's a boarding house 2 blocks down. Mrs. Chen's place. Tell her I sent you. She'll set you up with a room. Miss Whitmore, I'll show you to the back. Evelyn immediately started shaking her head. She wrote, I want to stay with Coulter. Miss, that wouldn't be... I don't care what it looks like. I've spent 3 weeks surrounded by men who wanted to hurt me. He's the only one I trust. Mercer looked at Coulter, who shrugged. I'll sleep in a chair. Won't be the first time. The sheriff sighed. Fine, but this stays quiet, you understand? Last thing we need is people talking. People are going to talk anyway, Coulter said. Might as well give them something true to talk about. Mercer couldn't argue with that. He showed them to the back room, which was exactly as advertised. A cot, a chair, a small table with a water pitcher. Not much, but it was clean, and it had a door that locked. I'll bring dinner in an hour, Mercer said. And Miss Whitmore, you're safe now. I give you my word on that. Evelyn nodded, but Coulter could see she didn't quite believe it yet. Safety was going to take more than a locked door and a sheriff's promise. When Mercer left, Evelyn sat on the cot and immediately pulled off the boots. Her feet were blistered and raw despite the thick socks. She winced, but didn't make a sound. Coulter grabbed the water pitcher and a clean rag from the table. Let me see. She hesitated, then extended one foot. The blisters were bad, some of them already popped and weeping. He cleaned them as gently as he could, but she still gripped the edge of the cot hard enough that her knuckles went white. Sorry, he said. She shook her head, reached for the pencil. You're helping. That's not something to apologize for. When both feet were clean and bandaged with strips torn from the rag, Coulter sat back in the chair. You should rest. It's been a long couple of days. So have you. I'm fine. You haven't slept more than a few hours since you found me. I'll sleep when I know for sure you're safe. She looked at him for a long moment, then wrote, Why do you care so much? Coulter didn't have a good answer for that. Or maybe he did, but he wasn't ready to say it out loud. You needed help. I was there. That's all. No, it's more than that. You could have left me with the sheriff and walked away, but you're still here. Yeah, well, he looked away. I'm stubborn, remember? Coulter. He met her eyes. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and something else, something that made his chest feel tight. Thank you, she wrote, for everything. I mean it. You don't. Yes, I do. You gave me my life back. That deserves more thanks than I know how to give. Before Coulter could respond, there was a knock on the door. Mercer came in carrying 2 plates of food and a pot of coffee. Stew from the hotel down the street, he said, setting everything on the table. Better than what you've been eating the last few days, I expect. He was right. The stew was thick with beef and potatoes, and the bread that came with it was fresh baked. They ate in silence, Mercer standing by the door with his arms crossed. When they finished, the sheriff collected the empty plates. Telegrams are sent. Should hear back sometime tomorrow. In the meantime, try to get some rest. I'll have a deputy stationed outside the door all night. After he left, Evelyn lay down on the cot and pulled the thin blanket over herself. Coulter settled into the chair with his rifle across his lap, prepared for another long night of keeping watch. But an hour later, when he glanced over, Evelyn was still awake, staring at the ceiling. "Can't sleep?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "Want to talk about it?" She sat up and reached for the pencil. "Every time I close my eyes, I see them. Vincent. The camp. Everything that happened. That's going to take time to fade." "What if it doesn't?" Coulter leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Then you learn to live with it. Same way soldiers learn to live with the war. It doesn't disappear, but it gets quieter. Eventually." "How do you know?" "Because I've done it." She studied his face in the lamplight. "What happened to you?" "I fought in the war. Saw things I wish I hadn't. Did things I'm not proud of. Spent a long time afterward trying to forget." "Did you?" "No. But I figured out how to keep moving forward anyway." "How?" "By finding something worth getting up for every morning. Even if it was just cattle or a hot cup of coffee or the way the sunrise looked over the mountains. Small things. They add up." Evelyn was quiet for a while, thinking. Then she wrote, "What gets you up now?" Coulter looked at her. Right now, sitting there with her hair tangled and her face bruised and her feet bandaged, asking him questions that cut too close to truths he didn't want to examine, she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "I'm still figuring that out," he said finally. She held his gaze and something passed between them. An understanding, maybe, or the beginning of one. Then she lay back down, and this time when she closed her eyes, she actually seemed to sleep. Coulter watched her breathe for a while, then forced himself to look away and focus on the door. He had a job to do. Keep her safe. Get her father here. Make sure those bastards who hurt her face justice. After that, he'd go back to his life and she'd go back to hers. And this strange, intense few days would become just another memory. Something to think about when he was alone on the range and wondering what might have been. That was how it had to be. A woman like her didn't belong with a man like him, no matter how much he was starting to wish otherwise. The night wore on. Somewhere outside, a drunk was singing off-key. A dog barked. The normal sounds of a frontier town settling in for the evening. And in the small room at the back of the sheriff's office, Coulter Hayes kept watch over a woman who was slowly teaching him that maybe, just maybe, there were things worth fighting for beyond simple survival. Morning came with the sound of activity in the main office. Deputies arriving, doors opening and closing, the low murmur of conversation. Coulter had dozed off sometime before dawn, and he woke stiff and sore in the chair. Evelyn was already awake, sitting on the cot and carefully rebraiding her hair. She looked over when he stirred and offered a small wave. "Morning," Coulter said, his voice rough from sleep. She smiled and reached for the paper. "Did you sleep at all?" "Enough." Liar. Before he could respond, Mercer knocked and entered with breakfast. Eggs, bacon, more of that good bread. "Telegrams came back," he said without preamble. "Your father's in Denver, Miss Whitmore. Says he'll be here in 3 days. Also says—" He paused, reading from a slip of paper. "Also says he's grateful you're alive and to tell you he loves you." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. She took the telegram from Mercer and read it herself, her lips moving silently over the words. "There's more," Mercer said. "Territorial Marshal is sending 2 deputies to help track down the men who took you. They should be here tomorrow. In the meantime, I've got my own men asking around town, seeing if anyone's seen strangers matching those descriptions." "Have they found anything?" Evelyn wrote. "Not yet, but it's early." Coulter stood and stretched, working the kinks out of his back. What about the body? You sending someone to recover it? Already sent 2 men at first light. You gave me good enough directions that they should find it. And when they do? Then we'll have evidence of at least 1 killing. Self-defense or not, it'll help build the case. Evelyn set down the telegram and wrote quickly. I want to help, however I can. Best thing you can do right now is rest and recover, Mercer said gently. Let us handle the rest. I've been doing nothing but waiting for 3 weeks. I need to do something. Mercer looked at Coulter, who shrugged. She's not wrong. Waiting's hard. The sheriff sighed. All right. I'll need a full written statement from you, Miss Whitmore. Everything you remember. Dates, locations, conversations, anything that might help us build a case. You feel up to that? She nodded firmly. Good. I'll bring paper and ink this afternoon. He headed for the door, then stopped. Hayes, can I talk to you outside? Coulter followed him into the main office. Mercer closed the door and lowered his voice. You planning to stick around through all this? That's the plan. She trusts you. I know. That's a responsibility, you understand? She's been through hell. Last thing she needs is someone getting close and then disappearing. Coulter met the sheriff's eyes. I'm not going to hurt her. Didn't say you would. But feelings have a way of getting complicated in situations like this. You saved her life. She's grateful. Sometimes grateful gets mistaken for something else. I know what I'm doing. Do you? Mercer crossed his arms. Because from where I'm standing, you look like a man who's in over his head and doesn't want to admit it. Coulter didn't have an answer for that. Look, Mercer said, his voice softening slightly. I'm not trying to give you a hard time. I'm just saying be careful, for both your sakes. Noted. Good. Now go eat your breakfast before it gets cold. Coulter went back into the room and found Evelyn staring out the small window at a slice of sky visible between buildings. She turned when he entered. What did he want? She wrote. Just checking in, making sure I'm not causing trouble. Are you? Not yet. She smiled at that. They ate breakfast together, the silence between them comfortable now, instead of awkward. When they finished, Evelyn started working on her statement while Coulter cleaned his rifle and tried not to think too hard about what Mercer had said. The day passed slowly. Mercer brought lunch, then more paper when Evelyn filled the first batch with her precise handwriting. A doctor came by in the afternoon to examine her injuries. A middle-aged woman with gentle hands who confirmed what Coulter already knew. Bruised ribs, strained throat, various contusions, but nothing that wouldn't heal with time. Late in the day, Mercer came back with the news. My men found the body, brought it back to town. It's Pike, all right. Had wanted posters on him from 3 territories for robbery and assault. Looks like your kidnappers weren't too particular about who they hired. And the others? Evelyn wrote. No sign yet, but we're watching the roads. That night, after Mercer left them alone again, Evelyn sat on the cot looking troubled. Coulter could see something working behind her eyes. What is it? He asked. She wrote, What if they don't come? What if they just disappear? Then they disappear and you're still free, but they'd never face justice for what they did. Sometimes that's how it works. Not every bad man gets what he deserves. That's not fair. No, Coulter agreed. It's not. She looked down at her hands. I want them to pay. All of them, especially Vincent. If they're smart, they're halfway to Mexico by now. And if they're not smart, Mercer will find them. And if they come here looking for me, then they'll have to go through me first. She looked up at him, and there it was again, that expression that made his chest tight. Don't look at me like that, he said quietly. Like what? Like I'm something I'm not. You're exactly what you are, she wrote, and that's more than enough. Coulter stood and moved to the window, needing distance. Your father's coming in 3 days. After that, you go back to Denver, back to your life. You need to remember that. Why? Because you're a judge's daughter from a wealthy family, and I'm a cowboy who doesn't own anything but a horse and the clothes on my back. That's not a future. That's just reality. The silence stretched out behind him. Finally, he heard the scratch of pencil on paper. When he turned around, she held up what she'd written. What if I don't want to go back? You don't mean that. How do you know what I mean? Because you're grateful and confused and you've been through something terrible, but that doesn't change who you are or where you belong. And where do I belong? Not here. Not with me. She stood and walked over to him, the paper clutched in her hand. She was close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, close enough that he had to fight the urge to reach for her. She wrote something new and held it up. What if you're wrong? I'm not. Coulter, this isn't real, he said, his voice harder than he meant it to be. None of it. You're grateful because I helped you, and I'm whatever I am because you needed help and I was there. But that's all it is. When your father comes and takes you back to civilization, you're going to realize that. And I'd rather you realize it now than later. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She turned away from him and went back to the cot, curling up with her back to him. Coulter stood by the window and hated himself. But it was better this way. Better to hurt her now than let her imagine a future that could never exist. Better to be the bad guy than let her fall for someone who couldn't give her the life she deserved. He told himself that all night while he sat in the chair and listened to her cry herself to sleep. And he almost believed it. Morning brought an uncomfortable silence that felt worse than any argument. Evelyn was already awake when Coulter stirred, sitting on the cot with her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the wall. She didn't look at him when he stood and stretched. He wanted to say something, apologize maybe, but the words stuck in his throat. What was there to apologize for? Telling the truth? Protecting both of them from a future that couldn't exist? Mercer brought breakfast and immediately picked up on the tension. He set the plates down and looked between them. Everything all right in here? Evelyn nodded without meeting anyone's eyes. Yeah, Coulter said. Fine. Mercer didn't believe either of them, but he was smart enough not to push. Territorial deputies arrived early this morning. They'll want to talk to you both. He looked at Evelyn. Especially you, miss. They need details about the men and the camp location. She reached for the pencil and wrote, I'll tell them whatever they need. Good. I'll bring them by after breakfast. When the sheriff left, Coulter sat in the chair and picked at his food without really tasting it. Across the small room, Evelyn did the same. The space between them felt like a canyon. Finally, she wrote something and held it up. I'm sorry. Coulter looked at the words, confused. For what? For making things complicated. You're right, I was confused. Evelyn? She shook her head and wrote more. You don't need to explain. I understand. But she didn't understand. That was the problem. She thought he'd rejected her because he didn't feel the same way, when the truth was so much worse and so much more complicated. He felt too much, and that terrified him. Before he could figure out how to say any of that, Mercer returned with two men in trail-worn clothes and deputy badges pinned to their vests. The older one was tall and lean with gray threading through his dark hair. The younger had a baby face that didn't match the hard look in his eyes. Miss Whitmore, the older deputy said, removing his hat. I'm Deputy Marshal Tom Garrett, and this is Deputy Jack Sullivan. We're here to help track down the men who took you. Evelyn nodded and gestured for them to sit at the small table. Garrett pulled out a notebook. We've read Sheriff Mercer's report, but we need more detail. Can you describe the camp where they held you? Location, layout, anything distinctive? She wrote steadily for several minutes, describing the camp in detail. A clearing surrounded by dense pine forest, a creek running along the eastern edge, a large granite outcropping to the north that looked like a broken tooth. 4 tents, a fire pit, horses picketed in a natural corral formed by fallen trees. Sullivan leaned forward. How far from where Mr. Hayes found you? Arishimit, Evelyn thought, then wrote, I'm not sure exactly. When Pike took me away from the camp, we rode for maybe 2 hours before he stopped. Direction? South, I think. The sun was behind us in the morning. Garrett made notes. And the men? You said there were 3 others besides Pike. Can you describe them in detail? She wrote about Vincent first. His scar, the way he moved like a coiled spring, the cold calculation in his eyes. Then the brothers, Carter and Webb, who looked similar enough to be twins but weren't. Carter had a crooked nose from an old break. Webb had a nervous habit of cracking his knuckles. Would you recognize them if you saw them again? Sullivan asked. Evelyn's hand shook slightly as she wrote, Yes, I'll never forget their faces. Good, because if they're still in the territory, we'll find them. Coulter spoke up from where he was standing by the window. What makes you think they're still around? Garrett looked at him. Mountain Star Consolidated, the mining company behind all this. They've got too much money invested to just walk away. If those men are smart, they disappeared. But in my experience, criminals who work for big operations aren't usually that smart. They think the money and power behind them makes them untouchable. You know about Mountain Star? Coulter asked. We've been building a case against them for months. This isn't their first time using violence to get what they want. But Judge Whitmore's the first person with enough spine to stand up to them. Garrett turned back to Evelyn. Your father's testimony, combined with yours, could bring down the whole operation. That's why we need to make sure you stay safe until this goes to trial. Evelyn wrote, How long will that take? Months, probably. Maybe longer. These things move slow, especially when you're going after people with that kind of money. Her face fell. Months of looking over her shoulder. Months of being afraid. Sullivan must have seen her expression because he said, We'll catch them before then, miss. I promise you that. Coulter didn't put much stock in promises, but he kept his mouth shut. The deputies spent another hour going over details, asking questions, making notes. When they finally left, Evelyn looked exhausted. She lay down on the cot without bothering to take off her boots. Coulter watched her for a moment, then said quietly, You did good, giving them all that information. She didn't respond. Evelyn. She turned to look at him, and the hurt in her eyes nearly broke him. I'm sorry, he said. About last night. I shouldn't have. She held up a hand to stop him, then wrote, Don't, please. It's easier if we just don't talk about it. So they didn't. Shan't. The next 2 days passed in a strange, painful limbo. Mercer kept them informed about the search, deputies and local men combing the mountains, checking abandoned camps and mining claims, asking questions in every settlement and trading post within 50 miles. But there was no sign of Vincent, Carter, or Webb. It was like they'd vanished into the wilderness. Evelyn spent most of her time writing, letters to her father, detailed accounts of her captivity for the court, anything to keep her hands and mind busy. Coulter helped Mercer's deputies search some of the closer areas, glad for an excuse to get out of that small room and away from the tension that followed him and Evelyn like a shadow. On the third day, early in the morning, a telegram arrived. Judge Whitmore would be in Red Hollow by evening. Evelyn's hands shook when Mercer showed her the message. She wrote, Finally. Coulter felt something twist in his chest. This was it. Her father would arrive, take her back to Denver, and that would be the end of it. The end of them. Not that there was a them to end, he reminded himself. Just a few days of proximity forced by circumstance. You should rest, Mercer said to Evelyn. Get yourself ready to see your father. She nodded and went back to the room. Coulter started to follow, but Mercer caught his arm. Word came back from the search parties, the sheriff said quietly. They found the camp where she was held. Abandoned, but recent. Can't be more than a few days old. So they ran. Looks that way. But here's the thing, they left in a hurry. Left supplies, gear, even some personal items. Whatever spooked them, it happened fast. Coulter thought about that. Pike not coming back would have done it. They'd know something went wrong. Maybe. Or maybe they got word that we were looking for them. Mercer shook his head. Either way, they're in the wind now. Could be anywhere. You think they'll come after her? Honestly? I don't know. If they're smart, they cut their losses and disappear. If they're desperate or stupid, he trailed off. Then we need to be ready. That's why I'm telling you, Judge Whitmore's arrival is going to draw attention. Everyone in town knows he's coming, which means anyone looking for his daughter will know where to find her. Coulter's jaw tightened. So we're using her as bait? No. We're being realistic about the situation. I've got extra men posted around the office, and Garrett's people are watching the roads. But you should be aware. I am. Mercer studied him. You care about her. It wasn't a question, so Coulter didn't answer it. Just be careful, Hayes. This thing isn't over yet. Coulter went back to the room and found Evelyn standing at the window, looking out at the street. She'd changed into a dress Mrs. Chen from the boarding house had brought over. Simple blue calico that actually fit her. Her hair was pinned up properly for the first time since he'd found her. She looked almost like the refined judge's daughter she was supposed to be. Almost. The bruises were fading but still visible, and there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Something harder. She turned when she heard him enter and managed a small smile. Then she wrote, "How do I look?" "Like yourself," Coulter said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." She studied him for a moment, then wrote, "What happens after my father comes?" "You go home. Get back to your life." "And you?" "Back to the Double J, I suppose. See if they'll still hire me after I disappeared for a week." Just like that. Just like that. She looked down at the paper in her hands. "I don't want to forget you." "You will. Give it time." "Is that what you want, for me to forget?" Coulter crossed to the window and stood beside her, careful not to touch. "What I want doesn't matter. This is how it has to be." "Why?" The word came out as barely a whisper, hoarse and broken, but it was a word. Evelyn's eyes went wide with shock. Coulter stared at her. "You just—" She touched her throat, her mouth forming the word again. This time, nothing came out. She tried once more, forcing the sound past damaged vocal cords, and managed another whisper. "Why?" "Don't," Coulter said. "Don't hurt yourself trying to—" But she was crying now, frustrated tears running down her cheeks as she kept trying to speak and failing. Finally, she grabbed the pencil and wrote furiously. It was there. For just a second, I could feel it. I said your name in my head, and it came out. "Evelyn, you need to rest your voice. Don't push." She shook her head and wrote more. "You don't understand. I've been trying for weeks and nothing worked. But just now, when I was thinking about you leaving, it just happened." Coulter didn't know what to say. The fact that her voice was coming back should have been good news. Should have been. But all he could think about was what she'd said and why she'd been able to say it. Before either of them could figure out what came next, there was a commotion in the front office. Voices raised, boots on wooden floors, the sound of someone important arriving. Mercer appeared in the doorway. "Miss Whitmore, your father's here." Evelyn's face went pale. She smoothed her dress with shaking hands and nodded. Judge Nathaniel Whitmore was exactly what Coulter expected. Tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed despite days of hard travel. He had the bearing of a man used to commanding respect and the sharp eyes of someone who missed nothing. When he stepped into the small room and saw his daughter, something cracked in that composed exterior. "Evelyn," he said, and his voice broke on her name. She ran to him, and he caught her in an embrace that looked like it hurt them both. Coulter could see the judge's shoulders shaking, could hear Evelyn's silent sobs. After a long moment, Whitmore pulled back and held his daughter at arm's length, taking in the fading bruises, the new hardness in her eyes. "My girl, what did they do to you?" Evelyn pulled out her paper and wrote, "I'm alive. That's what matters." "Your voice, it's coming back, slowly." The judge's expression went dark. "The men who did this, where are they?" "We're looking," Mercer said from the doorway. "We've got every lawman in the territory searching." Whitmore's attention shifted to Coulter, who had moved to stand against the far wall, trying to be invisible. "And you must be Mr. Hayes, the man who found my daughter." "Yes, sir." The judge studied him with the same intensity he probably used in the courtroom. Coulter felt like he was being weighed and measured, every detail cataloged and judged. "Sheriff Mercer tells me you saved Evelyn's life, multiple times." "I helped, that's all." "That's not what my daughter says." Whitmore pulled a telegram from his pocket. "She wrote that you risked everything to protect her, that you're the only reason she's alive." Coulter didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. "I owe you a debt I can never repay," the judge continued. "If there's anything I can do—" "There isn't," Coulter said. "I'm just glad she's safe." Whitmore looked like he wanted to argue, but Evelyn touched his arm and shook her head. She wrote something and showed it to her father. Coulter couldn't see what it said, but he saw the judge's expression change. Surprise, then concern, then something that might have been understanding. "I see," Whitmore said quietly. He looked at Coulter again, and this time there was something different in his eyes. "Mr. Hayes, might I speak with you privately?" Coulter glanced at Evelyn, who nodded. He followed the judge into the main office, where Mercer tactfully found somewhere else to be. Whitmore got straight to the point. "My daughter has feelings for you." Coulter's stomach dropped. "Sir, I never, I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm stating a fact. Evelyn is a smart, perceptive young woman, and she's not prone to flights of fancy." If she believes you're worth caring about, then you probably are. The judge paused. But I need to know your intentions. I don't have any intentions. She's going back to Denver with you, and I'm going back to my work. That's all. Is that what you want? Coulter met the judge's eyes. What I want doesn't matter. Why not? Because I'm a ranch hand with nothing to offer her. No money, no prospects, no future worth mentioning. She deserves better than that. Shouldn't she be the one to decide what she deserves? With respect, sir, she's been through hell. She's not thinking clearly. Whitmore's expression hardened. Don't presume to tell me about my daughter. I've known her for 24 years, and I've never seen her more certain about anything than she is about you. That hit Coulter harder than he expected. Judge, I'm not the right man for her. Because you're poor? Because you work cattle? Whitmore shook his head. I've seen wealthy men with every advantage destroy the women they claim to love. And I've seen men with nothing treat their wives like queens. Money doesn't make a man worthy. Character does. Even if that were true, her life is in Denver. Mine is out here. Those two things don't mix. They could if you wanted them to. Coulter looked away. I can't give her what she needs. What she needs, the judge said firmly, is someone who sees her strength and doesn't try to diminish it. Someone who respects her intelligence and her courage. Someone who will stand by her through difficulty instead of running at the first sign of trouble. He paused. From what I understand, you've already done all of that. That was different. That was survival. Was it? Whitmore moved to the window, looking out at the street. I'm going to tell you something, Mr. Hayes. When my wife died, Evelyn was only 7 years old. I watched that little girl bury her grief so deep that I thought I'd lost her too. She became quiet, careful, always trying to be perfect so I wouldn't have one more thing to worry about. For 17 years, she's lived that way, controlled, measured, never taking risks or showing too much emotion. He turned back to Coulter. Then you found her in those mountains. And for the first time since her mother died, my daughter is fighting for something she wants instead of just accepting what she thinks she should have. That matters, Mr. Hayes. That matters more than you know. Coulter didn't know what to say. The judge's words were carving away at every excuse he'd built up, exposing the truth underneath, that he was scared. Scared of wanting something he couldn't have. Scared of failing her. Scared of being exactly what he'd always believed he was, not good enough. Before he could respond, one of Mercer's deputies burst through the front door. Sheriff, we've got a problem. Mercer appeared from the back. What is it? 3 men just rode into town. They're asking questions about Judge Whitmore, about when he arrived and where he's staying. Coulter's blood went cold. Descriptions. One with a scar on his face, 2 younger ones, could be brothers. Vincent, Carter, and Webb. Mercer was already moving, calling for his other deputies. Where are they now? The saloon, but they were heading this way when I left. Whitmore's face had gone hard. They came for Evelyn. They came to finish what they started, Coulter said. He grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. We need to move her. Now. Move her where? Mercer demanded. They're already in town. Back room, Coulter said. Bar the door. Keep her locked down while we deal with this. There are 3 of them, Garrett said, appearing from wherever he'd been posted. Maybe more if they hired additional men. I don't care if there's 30 of them, Coulter said flatly. They're not getting to her. Mercer looked at Judge Whitmore. Sir, you should go to your daughter. Stay with her in the back room. But Whitmore was already pulling a revolver from inside his coat. I've spent 3 weeks feeling helpless while my daughter suffered. I'm not hiding while other men fight my battles. Judge, that's not a request, Sheriff. Mercer swore under his breath. Fine, but you stay behind cover and don't get yourself killed. I don't need that kind of paperwork. They quickly set up a defensive position. Garrett and Sullivan took positions at the windows. Mercer stationed himself behind the main desk. Coulter moved to the door, rifle ready, while Judge Whitmore stood to the side with his revolver drawn. Evelyn appeared in the doorway to the back room, her eyes wide when she saw the preparations. She started toward Coulter, but her father caught her arm. Evelyn, no. Go back inside and lock the door. She shook her head violently and pulled out her pencil. I won't hide anymore. This isn't about hiding, it's about staying safe. Let her decide, Coulter said quietly. He looked at Evelyn. You want to stay out here? You stay behind that desk with your father, and you don't move unless I tell you to. Understand? She nodded and moved to stand beside Judge Whitmore, who looked torn between pride and terror. They waited. Minutes stretched out like hours. Coulter kept his eyes on the street, watching for any sign of movement. Then he saw them. 3 men walking down the middle of the street like they owned it. Vincent in the lead, that scar visible even from this distance. The brothers flanking him, hands resting on their gun belts. They stopped about 30 yards from the sheriff's office. "Judge Whitmore," Vincent called out, "we need to talk." Whitmore stepped to the window, though he stayed back far enough to avoid being an easy target. "You have nothing to say that I want to hear." "Now that's not very neighborly. We rode all this way just to have a conversation." "You're done talking. You're done threatening my family. Surrender now, and maybe you'll live long enough to stand trial." Vincent laughed. "See, that's the problem. We can't really afford to stand trial. Too many inconvenient truths might come out. Too many important people might get embarrassed. Mountain Star Consolidated will throw you to the wolves the moment it's convenient," Whitmore said. "You think they care about hired thugs? Maybe not, but they care about silencing witnesses." Vincent's hand moved to his gun. "Last chance, Judge. Hand over the girl and we'll disappear. Keep her and things get ugly." "Over my dead body." "That can be arranged." Everything happened at once. Vincent drew his weapon. Carter and Webb followed a heartbeat later. Coulter saw the movement and fired through the window, his shot taking Vincent in the shoulder and spinning him around. Gunfire erupted from both sides, glass shattered, wood splintered. Coulter dropped below the window frame and worked the lever on his rifle, ejecting the spent cartridge. Beside him, Garrett and Sullivan were returning fire in a steady rhythm. Outside, Vincent had taken cover behind a water trough. Carter was crouched behind a hitching post, firing wildly. Webb had gone to ground somewhere Coulter couldn't see. "They've got us pinned!" Mercer shouted over the gunfire. Coulter risked a look. Vincent was shouting orders to his men, trying to coordinate. They were going to flank the building if someone didn't stop them. "I'm going out," Coulter said. "That's suicide," Garrett protested. "So is sitting here waiting for them to surround us." Coulter checked his ammunition. "I can circle around, come up behind them." "You'll never make it. Watch me." Before anyone could argue further, Coulter moved to the back door. He glanced at Evelyn one last time. She was staring at him with those dark eyes, and he could see the fear there, the wordless plea for him not to go. But this was the only way to end it. He slipped out the back door into the alley and started running. The alley smelled like garbage and horse manure, but Coulter barely noticed. He moved fast, keeping low, using the backs of buildings as cover, while gunfire echoed from the main street. His boots hit dirt quietly, years of tracking game making him instinctively silent even when speed mattered more. He circled around behind the general store, then cut through a narrow gap between 2 warehouses. From here he could see Webb crouched behind a rain barrel at the corner of the street, his attention fixed on the sheriff's office. The kid was young, maybe 22, and his hands were shaking as he reloaded his revolver. Coulter raised his rifle. "Don't move." Webb spun around, fumbling with his weapon. Coulter fired a warning shot that kicked up dirt 6 inches from the kid's boot. "Next one goes through your chest. Drop it." The revolver hit the ground. Webb raised his hands, his face pale. "Don't shoot. Please don't shoot." "On your knees. Hands behind your head." Webb complied and Coulter moved forward quickly, kicking the revolver away. He pulled rope from his belt and tied the kid's hands tight enough to hurt. "Where's your brother?" "I don't—" Coulter pressed the rifle barrel against Webb's temple. "Where?" "Roof," Webb gasped. "Carter's on the roof of the saloon. He's got a rifle." Damn it. That gave Carter a clear line of sight on anyone trying to leave the sheriff's office. Coulter looked up and saw the silhouette of a man prone on the saloon's false front, rifle trained on the street below. He left Webb tied and moved toward the saloon, staying in the shadows. The back entrance was unlocked, probably how Carter had gotten up there in the first place. Inside was chaos. Patrons were pressed against the walls or hiding under tables, while the bartender crouched behind the bar with a shotgun. "Federal business," Coulter said quietly as he passed. "Stay down." He found the stairs and climbed as silently as he could. The second floor was a series of small rooms where the saloon girls worked. Empty now. At the far end, a ladder led up to a trapdoor in the ceiling. Coulter climbed carefully, easing the trapdoor open just enough to see out. Carter was 10 feet away, completely focused on the street below. His rifle was braced on the false front, and his finger was on the trigger. Coulter pushed the trapdoor fully open and raised his rifle. Carter! The kid twisted around, bringing his weapon with him. Coulter fired first. The shot caught Carter in the leg and he screamed, his rifle clattering across the roof. He tried to crawl toward it, but Coulter was already there, kicking the weapon away. Stay down! Carter clutched his bleeding leg, his face twisted in pain. You shot me! You're lucky that's all I did. Coulter kept his rifle trained on him. How many others are there? Just you three? Go to hell. Wrong answer. Coulter moved his rifle to point at Carter's other leg. How many? Just us. Just us, I swear. From the street below, Vincent's voice cut through the gunfire. Carter! Webb! Report! Neither brother answered. The shooting slowed, then stopped completely. Tense silence fell over Red Hollow. Looks like your boys are out of commission, Vincent, Mercer called from the sheriff's office. Give it up. Not a chance. Vincent fired twice more at the windows. Then Coulter heard running footsteps. He looked over the edge of the roof and saw Vincent sprinting toward the livery stable at the far end of town. He was making a run for it. Coulter didn't think. He just moved. He dropped down through the trapdoor, hit the stairs at a run, and burst out the back door of the saloon. By the time he reached the street, Vincent had disappeared into the stable. Garrett and Sullivan were already moving to intercept, but Coulter was closer. He ran flat out, his lungs burning, and reached the stable just as he heard a horse scream inside. He entered in a crouch, rifle ready. The stable was dim and full of shadows. Stalls lined both sides, most of them occupied. At the far end, Vincent was trying to saddle a horse, but his wounded shoulder made his movements clumsy. It's over, Vincent, Coulter said. Vincent turned, his gun already in his good hand. He fired twice, and Coulter dove behind a support post. Wood exploded next to his head, splinters cutting his cheek. You should have stayed out of this, cowboy! Vincent was backing toward the rear exit, still trying to keep his gun trained on Coulter while fumbling with the horse. This had nothing to do with you. You made it my business when you hurt her. The judge's daughter? Vincent laughed, bitter and harsh. She was just leverage, nothing personal. It was personal to her. Coulter moved to a different position, using the stalls as cover. Every time you hit her, every time you scared her, that was personal. She should have been stronger, should have broken faster. Vincent got the saddle cinched and swung up onto the horse, wincing at the pain in his shoulder. Instead, she made everything harder than it needed to be. Red rage flooded Coulter's vision. He stepped out from cover, rifle up. Get down from that horse. Make me. Vincent spurred the animal forward, trying to run Coulter down. The horse was terrified and confused, rearing up at the last second. Coulter threw himself to the side, rolling through the dirt, and came up firing. The first shot went wide. The second caught Vincent in the chest. He fell from the saddle hard, hitting the ground with a sound like a sack of grain dropped from height. The horse bolted, running for the safety of the open air. Coulter approached carefully, rifle still raised. Vincent was on his back, blood spreading across his shirt, his breath coming in wet gasps. His gun had fallen several feet away. Finish it, Vincent rasped. Go on. Coulter looked at him, at this man who'd tortured Evelyn for weeks, who'd stolen her voice and tried to break her spirit. It would be easy. One more shot and it would be over. No trial, no chance of some lawyer getting him off on a technicality. But then he thought about what Judge Whitmore had said, about character, about being the kind of man who did the right thing even when it was harder. No, Coulter said. You're going to live long enough to stand trial. Long enough for Evelyn to watch you hang. Vincent tried to laugh, but it came out as a cough that sprayed blood. Doesn't matter. Mountain Star. They'll never let it get that far. Then they'll hang too. Garrett and Sullivan burst into the stable, weapons drawn. They took in the scene quickly, Vincent bleeding on the ground, Coulter standing over him with his rifle still raised. He alive? Garrett asked. Barely. Good. We need him alive. Sullivan moved forward with rope to bind Vincent's hands. The other two? Wounded but breathing, one tied up in the alley, one shot on the saloon roof. Garrett nodded with approval. Hell of a job, Hayes. Coulter didn't respond. He walked out of the stable into the afternoon sunlight and found half the town gathered in the street, watching. Mercer was there, and Judge Whitmore, and dozens of curious onlookers drawn by the gunfire. And Evelyn. She was standing in front of the sheriff's office, her face pale, her eyes searching the crowd until they found him. The moment they did, she started running. She hit him hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs, her arms wrapping around him so tight he could barely breathe. He felt her shaking, felt the hot tears soaking into his shirt. "I'm all right," he said quietly, his arms coming up to hold her. "I'm all right." She pulled back just enough to look at his face, her hands touching the cuts from the wood splinters, checking for injuries. Then she pressed her forehead against his chest, and he felt her trying to speak, her throat working silently. "Don't," he said gently. "Don't hurt yourself trying." But she shook her head stubbornly and tried again. This time a sound came out, broken and hoarse, but unmistakable. "Coulter." His name. She'd said his name. Something cracked wide open in his chest. He held her tighter, burying his face in her hair, and for the first time in years felt something he'd thought he'd lost forever. Hope. Org. The trial took 4 months to organize. Mountain Star Consolidated tried everything to prevent it, bribing witnesses, intimidating officials, filing endless procedural motions. But Judge Whitmore was relentless, and with the testimony of Evelyn, the captured kidnappers, and a paper trail linking the company directly to the conspiracy, the case was airtight. Vincent, Carter, and Webb were sentenced to hang. The executives behind Mountain Star got 20 years in territorial prison. The company was dissolved, its assets seized and sold to pay restitution to its victims. Through it all, Coulter stayed in Red Hollow. He took a job working security for the courthouse during the trial, which mostly meant standing around looking intimidating and making sure no one tried anything stupid. The pay was decent, and it gave him a reason to stay close to Evelyn. Her voice came back slowly, in fits and starts. Some days she could speak nearly normally. Other days she could barely manage a whisper, but she kept working at it, refusing to let the damage define her. She also refused to go back to Denver. "I'm not ready," she told her father one evening over dinner at the hotel. Her voice was quiet but clear. "Not yet." Judge Whitmore looked at Coulter, who was sitting across the table trying to be invisible. "Does this have anything to do with a certain ranch hand?" Evelyn's cheeks colored. "It has to do with me needing time to figure out who I am now, after everything that happened." "And you can't do that in Denver?" "Denver is your world, Father. I need to find mine." Whitmore was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You know I'll support whatever you decide, but I worry about you." "I know, but I'm stronger than you think." "I'm starting to realize that." After the trial ended and the sentences were carried out, Coulter finally went back to the Double J Ranch. The foreman was annoyed that he disappeared for months, but willing to overlook it when he heard the full story. Coulter settled back into the rhythm of ranch work, mending fences, moving cattle, sleeping under stars. But it felt different now, empty in a way it hadn't before. He'd been back 3 weeks when a rider came out to find him, said there was someone waiting at the ranch house, someone who'd ridden all the way from Red Hollow asking for him. Coulter's heart was pounding as he rode back. He knew who it was before he saw her. Evelyn was sitting on the porch steps, wearing riding clothes and looking nervous. When she saw him approach, she stood. "Hi," she said. Her voice was still a little hoarse, but it was hers. "Hi," Coulter said, dismounting. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to see you, talk to you, without my father or the sheriff or half the town watching." "All right." She took a breath. "You left without saying goodbye." "Figured it was easier that way." "Easier for who?" Coulter didn't answer. "I've been thinking," Evelyn said, "about what you said, about how I'd forget you, given time." "And?" "You were wrong. I haven't forgotten. I don't think I ever will." "Evelyn, let me finish." She stepped closer. "You told me I was confused, that I was grateful and didn't know the difference between that and something real. But it's been 4 months, Coulter. 4 months of living a normal life, being safe, having time to think, and I'm not confused anymore. You should be with someone who can give you the life you deserve. What life is that? The one where I go to parties and smile at men I don't respect, where I pretend to be interested in their money and their status and their plans for the future." She shook her head. "I tried that life. It nearly suffocated me. So what do you want?" "I want something real. I want someone who sees me. All of me, including the parts that aren't polished or perfect. and doesn't try to fix me or change me or make me smaller. She looked at him. I want you. Coulter felt like he couldn't breathe. I'm a ranch hand. I don't own property or have money saved or any kind of prospects worth mentioning. I don't care about that. Your father, my father likes you, respects you. He told me that if I was determined to be stubborn about this, at least I was being stubborn about a good man. That surprised him. He said that? He also offered you a job, managing a ranch he owns outside Denver. Better pay, your own house, actual prospects. She smiled slightly. He's not subtle. And if I don't want to work for your father, then we figure something else out. But Coulter, her voice cracked slightly, and she paused to clear her throat. I'm not asking you to change your life for me. I'm asking if there's room in it for both of us. Coulter looked at her standing there in the afternoon sunlight, brave and determined and so far from the terrified woman he'd found in the forest. She'd survived hell and come out the other side stronger. She'd fought for herself, for her voice, for the right to choose her own future. And she was choosing him. I'm scared, he admitted. Scared I'll let you down. Scared I'm not enough. You saved my life. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. You stood between me and men who wanted to kill me, and you did it without hesitating. She took his hand. You're more than enough. You always have been. Something in Coulter's chest finally stopped fighting. He pulled her close and kissed her, and it felt like coming home. When they broke apart, she was crying and smiling at the same time. Is that a yes? Yeah, he said, his voice rough. Yeah, it is. My pasta. 3 years later, they stood on the porch of their ranch house watching the sun set behind the mountains. It wasn't the property Judge Whitmore had offered. Coulter had politely declined that, wanting to build something on his own terms. Instead, they'd scraped together enough for a small spread east of Red Hollow, where they ran cattle and took in travelers who needed a safe place to rest. The ranch had become known as a refuge. Women fleeing bad situations, families displaced by mine closures, kids with nowhere else to go. Evelyn couldn't turn anyone away, and Coulter had stopped trying to talk her out of it. You know we're going to end up with 20 people living here at this rate, he said, watching a widow and her 3 children they'd taken in last week playing near the barn. Would that be so bad? Evelyn asked. Her voice was fully restored now, though it still got hoarse when she was tired. No, I guess not. She leaned against him. My father wrote again, says the territorial governor wants to appoint you to a law enforcement position. What did you tell him? That you'd think about it. I'm thinking no. I figured, she smiled. He also said the teaching position in Red Hollow is still open if I want it. Do you? Maybe? I've been thinking about it. She turned to look at him. What do you think? I think you'd be good at it. I also think you're good at what you're doing here. Helping people? Yeah. We're both doing that, she pointed out. You just don't like to admit it. He couldn't argue with that. They'd built something here that neither of them had expected. A home, a community, a purpose beyond simple survival. Their son, almost 2 years old now, came running around the corner of the house, chasing a chicken that clearly wanted nothing to do with him. Evelyn laughed and scooped him up before he could catch it. Easy, Thomas. The chickens are friends, not toys. The boy babbled something that might have been an argument and squirmed to get down. She set him loose, and he toddled off toward his father, who caught him and swung him up onto his shoulders. Higher, Thomas demanded, his voice piping and clear. This is as high as you get, Coulter said. Any higher, and your mother will kill me. Evelyn walked over and stood beside them, one hand resting on Coulter's arm, while the other steadied Thomas. They stood like that for a while, watching the sun paint the clouds orange and gold. Do you ever think about that day in the forest? She asked quietly. When you found me. Sometimes. Do you regret it? Coulter looked at her, at the life they'd built, at their son laughing on his shoulders. Not for a second. Even when it got hard? Especially then. She smiled. Me too. Later, after Thomas was asleep and the house was quiet, they sat on the porch in the darkness. Evelyn was writing in a journal, something she'd started doing during the trial, and never stopped, recording her thoughts, her memories, the lessons she'd learned. What are you writing about? Coulter asked. She looked up. About how strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just getting up every morning even when you're scared. Sometimes it's choosing to trust someone even after people broke that trust. Sometimes it's building something new from the pieces of what was destroyed. That sounds about right. I'm also writing about you. She showed him the page. About how you taught me that good people aren't the ones who never struggle. They're the ones who struggle and keep trying anyway. Coulter read her words and felt that familiar tightness in his chest. The one that came from being seen and understood and valued for exactly who he was. You give me too much credit, he said. No, I give you exactly the right amount. She closed the journal and moved to sit beside him, his arm coming around her shoulders. We saved each other, Coulter. That's what matters. And maybe that was the truth of it. Not some grand romance or dramatic rescue, but two broken people finding each other in the wilderness and deciding that broken wasn't the same as beyond repair, that you could take all the pieces of a shattered life and build something new, something better. It wouldn't always be easy. Some days Evelyn still woke up with nightmares. Some days Coulter still doubted whether he was worthy of the life he'd been given, but they worked through it together, one day at a time, one small choice at a time. The wilderness that had nearly destroyed them both had become the foundation of their home. The violence that had brought them together had been transformed into a fierce determination to protect others from the same fate. And the silence that had once trapped Evelyn now only emphasized how powerful her voice had become, speaking up for those who couldn't, fighting for those who'd lost the strength to fight for themselves. Sometimes strength means surviving. Sometimes it means knowing when to ask for help. And sometimes, the hardest times, it means believing you deserve the happiness you've found, even when part of you says you don't. As they sat there in the darkness, surrounded by the life they'd built from nothing, Coulter finally understood something he'd been fighting for years. Worthiness wasn't something you earned through grand gestures or perfect choices. It was something you claimed, day after day, by showing up and doing your best and refusing to give up on the people you loved. Evelyn's hand found his in the darkness. They sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of their ranch, knowing that tomorrow would bring its own challenges and small victories. But for now, this was enough, more than enough. They were home.